Hey everybody, it's Mr. Karthikeyan. This is going to be the lecture for your first asynchronous assignment around taking notes about this idea of evolution. This is going to be our introduction to evolution, including studying a lot of these questions that we're going to try to answer throughout this next unit. So we want to really try to figure out what evolution is, how it relates to this overall grand structure of biology. If we remember from the very end of our first class, we discussed the characteristics of life. And one of those characteristics is that all life changes and progresses, and it changes over time. And so we're going to try to figure out which of these things contribute to the function of life, how do these things relate to biology, and whether we can reconstruct evolutionary history to figure out the starting of life, or the beginning of our time here on the planet. So here we're going to be taking notes. We've already sort of explained the importance of notes given the way that we are virtually this year, but also just in general, if you can take away anything from this class to be able to take effective notes. One thing that I want to remind you is to not write down everything that you see on these slides. I'm obviously going to upload the PowerPoint slides, but the key is to summarize the information that I've given you in this lecture and write them down in ways that are meaningful for you. Notes are only useful insofar as you're learning while you're taking them, and so I would use this opportunity to go through a singular learning method. Feel free to pause the video at any time that you want so that you can get the information that you need and you're writing down everything that you need. I suggest using the outline method, which I've sort of given up here, where you write the main topic and you have subtopics that are related to it. And I'll actually also upload an exemplar version of the notes for this lecture so that you have them with you. So we're going to start out with an example that we've seen a lot, something called antibiotic resistance. We're going to watch a video about antibiotic resistance and then try to explain how evolution contributes to this phenomenon.
Let's back up a bit. You've probably taken antibiotics at some point in your life. 4 out of 5 Americans are prescribed them every year. Since being developed in the 1940s, they've literally saved hundreds of millions of lives. But this record of success may be coming to an end. In the past few decades, doctors have witnessed the rise of what are called antibiotic-resistant bacteria, or what the news media has dubbed superbugs.
Sounding the alarm about nightmare superbugs.
U.S. doctors saying their worst nightmare has come true.
It is the end of the road for antibiotics.
We are seeing now the emergence globally of some forms of bacteria that are effectively untreatable.
Now in 42 states, highly contagious, deadly, and drug-resistant.
So how serious is this issue? Let's take a look at a real-life example. In 2013, Frontline told the story of one affected patient, an 11-year-old girl from Arizona named Addie, who one day complained to her mother about a pain in her hip.
I thought, well, she's just finishing up softball. She had been to the track meet, it all kind of, it could have been an injury. I gave her some ibuprofen. As the night wore on, her pain got worse.
After Addie's condition worsened, her mother rushed her to an emergency room. Doctors would eventually diagnose her with a bacterial infection called Staph aureus that had made its way into her blood, possibly through picking at a scab. But things took an even more dire turn when Addie contracted a different bacteria while in the hospital, a highly resistant strain called Stenotrophomonas.
She was first put on one antibiotic that's good for Stenotrophomonas, and it worked for a while. And then guess what? The antibiotic doesn't work anymore. Let's give her a different one. Well, and then it would, work. A couple weeks, 3 weeks, and then the Stenotrophomonas would sort of like bloom back up, rear its ugly head, so to speak.
And you're doing great. You are.
Finally, one day, they said something I never thought I would hear. The Stenotrophomonas is pan-resistant. Pan meaning resistant to everything.
I had to go to her and say, I don't have options based on medical science. I've run out of options. I don't see a way out of this.
Miraculously, even without more antibiotics at their disposal, doctors were able to surgically remove the infection and provide Addie with a lung transplant. While this has given her an extension on her life and allowed her to return home, most lung transplant patients do not live more than 5 years. Unfortunately, Addie's story is far from unique. The World Health Organization blamed drug-resistant bacteria for over 700,000 deaths last year, and predicts that by 2050, it could exceed 10 million.
So antibiotic resistance is something that we've talked a little bit about, and the way that evolution relates to this phenomenon is something that we're going to talk about in class when we get back together on Tuesday and Wednesday. But I want you to think about right now how you think evolution could contribute to this phenomenon. I know that we've gone over it a little bit, but it's something that you should consider. So we'll keep going. Sorry. Okay, so what exactly is evolution? Evolution is a change in a population from generation to generation. Something that we covered a lot in the last class in Biology 11 is the idea that evolution is something that happens to populations, not individuals. So I'd make sure that you underline and understand that it's something that happens to populations, not individuals. The reason that this is important is because evolution is not about a singular Australopithecus turning into Homo erectus, et cetera, but rather it's about a process, a way that organisms change over time due to what happens to their group, their population. So it's not a singular moment, not a singular change, but rather a large-scale, long-term event. Something that we went over a little bit last year as well is the history of the theory of evolution. At the beginning, it's important to understand why this theory really matters, because at the beginning, Aristotle, a bunch of Greek people, and even some other people beyond that, thought that life was arranged on a hierarchy, that all life sort of exists from zero to God, from plants over here and animals, and then to higher order animals, including some fish over here, and then birds, which are actually for some reason above the fish, which is interesting, then people, then angels, and then God. And so for a while, we sort of thought that evolution progressed in a hierarchy, that there were some things that were really simple, like plants. Plants are very simple organisms, and then things that are very complex, like humans. And so we thought that there was sort of an arrangement of life that would proceed from the simplest sort of bug to the largest human. However, this is currently not the existing belief for a lot of reasons that we'll go over right now, actually. So one of the scientists that sort of began to change this view is named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarckian evolution was one of the first ideas of how we can understand the dynamics of the changing world and the changing of organisms that go beyond this idea of a linear progression. So Lamarck sort of was around when fossils were being discovered, when geology was really progressing, so a lot of other scientific fields were progressing really well. So he proposed a theory called gradual change, that species would gradually change over time, and eventually that he thought that was evolution. However, Lamarck's mechanism was incorrect for 3 reasons. One, he assumed that there was a tendency towards perfection. Similarly to the last idea, Lamarck believed that living things had an innate instinct to adapt, as in the way that you would evolve as a being is that you would try to do something, like you would grow a longer neck in order to reach for leaves, and so that's why giraffes exist, or like you would grow a trunk if you were an elephant in order to be able to reach your food. However, this tended not to be the case. The second idea that he had was use and disuse. So Lamarck thought that body parts that were used a lot grew stronger, and those that didn't get used would actually disappear. And so this runs into an issue of something that we discussed last year called vestigial body parts. So things like your appendix, or some humans are born with tails when they're actually born that get cut off, and something like your wisdom teeth, which you don't actually need. Those things are still around, which really begs the question of why are they still around? So there must not be this idea of use and disuse, because things get discarded. Those vestigial organs get discarded. The last thing is about acquired characteristics. Now, Lamarck believed that inheritance worked with acquired characteristic, i.e. that organisms pass down characteristics that they get during their lifetime to new organisms. For example, if you ended up getting really strong because you worked out a lot, Lamarck thought that that meant you could pass down your muscles to your offspring. We know intuitively that that's not true, but for a long time, that's what people thought of how organisms worked. And so here is his example of giraffes, of acquired characteristics, or actually of the first idea here, of the tendency towards perfection, that this giraffe would over time just stretch its neck in order to get to the higher tree branches and would eventually get a really long neck. This was, however, not the case. Instead, we found that some animals are born with longer necks and that those animals end up surviving. So that is what we call natural selection that we'll get to in a second. But the key on the AP exam is that you cannot be a Lamarckian. Don't be Lamarckian on the AP exam. Animals don't want, animals don't desire, organisms don't desire. Like a plant doesn't want to get more leaves, a plant doesn't want to get more food. The plant just happens to be born with it. So make sure that you're not reflecting desire on the AP exam, because those things don't really exist. So the history of the current theory of evolution, or the idea of natural selection, began with Charles Darwin, a very famous explorer and a very famous naturalist. He voyaged on something called the HMS Beagle, which is a ship. It's, I guess, an important fact to know. This is often asked about. HMS Beagle. He explored a bunch of different areas. He explored all the way through Europe, across South America, and famously in the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands is where he made a lot of his discoveries about organisms. So Charles Darwin, initially, he looked at something about what happened to dogs. So there's a bunch of dogs around. And he saw that, wolves are very different from dogs, but we knew that wolves sort of came from dogs. So Darwin found this idea of an artificial selection. What happened was humans selected for certain traits in these wolves and bred only those wolves with those traits together until they ended up getting the dog. So for example, how we go from this big animal to this little French bulldog over here is that you find a wolf that was born with a shorter snout, and then you breed that wolf with another wolf with a shorter snout. So two wolves with short snouts, and then over time, as we go on and on, we ended up getting the French bulldog. So over time, we can do this artificially. And this is what we call artificial selection, when humans breed plants and animals for certain characteristics. And so we kind of also did this with wild mustard. Wild mustard, we used artificial selection. We picked out the leaves. That's actually what we ended up knowing as kale. We picked out the axillary buds. That's what Brussels sprouts are. Cabbage is the tip of the wild mustard plant, and broccoli is the flower and the stem. So all of these different vegetables actually just come from wild mustard itself. So wild mustard, we artificially selected to be these different plants. And the same thing we did with wolves. And so wolves were sort of bred into different ways, and we get the current species of dogs that we have now. So Darwin suggested that this idea of artificial selection is the same way that nature was doing it. And he proposed an idea called natural selection. So natural selection, by definition, is the idea that some individuals have traits that increase their fitness or their ability to survive and reproduce in their environment. And this is something that we covered a lot in the last class. So some key things to understand here is fitness. The term fitness means the ability to survive and the ability to reproduce. You have to have both. It's not sufficient enough to just live. You have to be able to pass down those traits. So without the ability to survive and reproduce, you don't really have fitness. And so the theory of natural selection is that, for example, we can see in this picture here, what's going on is we have some mice that are tan, some mice that are gray. The mice that are tan are going to get eaten up by the bird. So the only mice that will be left are the mice that are gray, because they can blend in with their environment. So over time, the gray mice will breed with other gray mice, because they're the only ones left. And then eventually, in a few generations, the whole population will sort of change to being largely gray mice. And so we can see that this is a population that changes over time. It's not that this one tan mouse is turning into a gray mouse. That's not happening. But rather that the mice are literally, their population is changing over time to look like the fitter individuals, so the ones that are experiencing more fitness or the capability to survive and reproduce. Natural selection requires 4 key factors. We're going to discuss each of those key factors. The first idea is genetic variation within a population. So this means there has to be something unique about some parts of the population. Here you can see that there's some orange ladybugs and some yellow ladybugs. So there's genetic variation. There's some difference between the population here. The second is that the traits need to be able to pass down, so inheritance of traits from parents to offspring. So this means that whatever the genetic variation is, it needs to be able to get to the next offspring. If this yellow ladybug was not actually yellow because of its genetics, but rather it was just spray painted or something, then it wouldn't be inheritable, so it couldn't contribute to evolution. Third thing is competition for limited resources, aka pressure. So you need something that actually limits the resources or limits the population in some way. Because there's no reason for a species to evolve if the environment's really stable. For example, in our image about these birds over here, right? If there was no predator, like if there's no hawk, you wouldn't see a change in the population. The population would stay the exact same because there's nothing causing this population to want to change. The only reason that the population changes is because of some pressure. In this case, the bird, the predator, is the pressure. But in other cases, that might not be the case. It might be some sort of an environmental thing. In the case of there's a famous case about moths and pollution, why that made them more vulnerable. So competition here, it means that there needs to be some sort of pressure that's exerted on the organism. The last thing is an adaptation. An adaptation is the increasing in fitness. So similarly to competition here, an adaptation is what is this genetic variation doing to actually make this organism fitter? So it is the color making it more able to blend in with the environment. Here you can see this example of a pangolin. Interestingly, some people think that the pangolin is the reason that COVID started. Some people think that people ate a pangolin, which is why COVID was spread from the open air market in Wuhan. But anyway, as besides the point. Adaptations are things that increase fitness or your reproductive ability. So how does this genetic variation actually contribute to the organism being able to survive better? And so you actually need all 4 of these things. So you need all 4 of them combined in order for evolution to occur. So when we identify problems that can create the pressure for evolution, we need all 4: genetic variation, inheritance of traits, competition for limited resources, and adaptation. That's the end of the notes for today. Here's the key vocabulary from today: evolution, artificial selection, natural selection, fitness, genetic variation, inheritance, competition, and adaptation. So make sure that you, in your notes, have these identified somewhere with definitions for each of them, and have taken effective notes on the overall slideshow. That's it for today. So your homework or your asynchronous work for Monday will be to watch this lecture, make sure that you've completed that, taken effective notes on everything, and then you'll submit those notes onto Canvas on this assignment. All right, I'll see you all this week. Have a good one.